The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm, golden hue across the sprawling park. Trees lined the paved pathways, offering shade to the handful of people who strolled leisurely, enjoying the serene afternoon. It was the kind of day Marcus Davis appreciated most: quiet, calm, and disconnected from the usual grind. As a seasoned FBI agent, Marcus was used to intense days, often brimming with the demands of investigations, and balancing the weight of justice on his shoulders. But today was different. Today he'd left his badge and his responsibilities behind, choosing instead to enjoy the simplicity of a park bench under a tall oak tree. Marcus stretched his legs out in front of him, allowing the rhythmic sounds of leaves rustling in the breeze and distant chatter to wash over him. Marcus was a man of composure. He had learned early in his career that staying calm was half the battle. People expected him to be intense, given the nature of his work and the many cases that had come across his desk. And sure, there had been days when the pressure was heavy, days he'd wanted to fight back against the injustice that seemed to surface time and again. But today was about peace. He opened a well-worn paperback that he'd been carrying around for months. There was something grounding about the feel of a physical book, an escape into a world far removed from his own reality. He was only a few pages in, letting the characters and plot absorb him, when he noticed a figure approaching from the corner of his eye. Turning his head, Marcus saw a tall, stern-looking police officer in a dark blue uniform walking toward him. He recognized the type instantly: Officer Brian Harkins. The man's gaze was intense, his walk purposeful. Marcus knew that look. He'd seen it in colleagues and even in himself during difficult moments, although his own version had always come from a place of intention, not assumption. But in this officer's eyes, Marcus could see something else: distrust. "Good afternoon, sir," Harkins said, coming to a stop in front of Marcus's bench. His tone was polite but clipped, holding that edge Marcus was all too familiar with. It was the kind of voice one used when asserting authority. Marcus returned the greeting calmly, meeting the officer's gaze. "Afternoon," Marcus replied, folding the corner of his page and closing the book with a faint smile. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Harkins didn't respond to the remark. Instead, he eyed Marcus with a critical gaze, as if sizing him up. There was a hint of tension that Marcus could feel in the air, the kind he'd encountered numerous times before. But today, on his day off, he found it more frustrating than anything else. "What brings you out here?" Harkins asked, his gaze sweeping over Marcus in a way that felt all too familiar. His eyes lingered a bit too long, betraying the unspoken questions behind them. Marcus took a steadying breath. He could tell where this was going, though he'd hoped, perhaps naively, that he could avoid it. "Just enjoying the weather, officer. Nice day for a break, don't you think?" Harkins's eyes narrowed slightly, as though he was trying to discern if Marcus's relaxed demeanor was genuine. He glanced over his shoulder, and Marcus realized that a few passers-by had slowed their steps, casting curious glances in their direction. The calm, relaxing environment he'd settled into had shifted into something else entirely. "Mind showing me some identification?" Harkins asked, his voice losing the politeness and now holding a sharper, almost accusatory tone. "Just routine." Marcus paused, feeling a small flicker of frustration rise within him. He knew he could easily flash his FBI credentials and likely end this encounter. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the principle of it all. He was here, simply a man in a park enjoying his day off. Why should he have to prove himself to this officer, who had walked up with assumptions written all over his face? "Is there any reason you're asking, officer?" Marcus asked carefully, keeping his tone as measured as possible. "I don't believe I've done anything to cause suspicion." The question seemed to throw Harkins off momentarily, a shadow of irritation flashing across his face. He wasn't used to being questioned, that much was clear. For a brief moment, Marcus thought he saw doubt, as if Harkins himself were questioning his motives. But then the officer's expression hardened again. "Just a precaution," Harkins insisted, his voice now carrying an edge. "You fit a certain profile." There it was. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, thick with the weight of unspoken biases. Marcus felt a familiar pang in his chest, a mix of anger and resignation. He'd been through situations like this before, enough times to know that speaking out wouldn't change much. not in this moment. But there was also a quiet resilience within him. He had promised himself that he wouldn't let situations like these pull him into anger or resentment. Instead, he met Harkins's gaze steadily, his calm demeanor unwavering. "All right, officer," Marcus said, keeping his voice level. He reached into his jacket pocket, retrieving his ID, his hands moving deliberately slow, aware of how any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. Harkins watched his every move, his body tensed as though expecting something dangerous. As Marcus handed over his ID, Harkins took it, his eyes flickering to the name and title before him. Marcus Davis, FBI Special Agent. The officer's face shifted ever so slightly, a glimmer of surprise flashing in his eyes. But just as quickly, he masked it, straightening his posture. "Agent Davis," he said, his voice momentarily faltering before regaining its assertiveness. "Thank you for your cooperation." Marcus met his gaze without a hint of resentment. Instead, there was only the steady calm that had become his armor, his way of moving through the world. "Of course, officer," Marcus replied evenly. "Just doing my part." As Harkins handed back his ID, Marcus could see the reluctance in the officer's expression, as though he wanted to say something more but couldn't find the words. Marcus took his ID back, placing it gently into his pocket, and offered the faintest of nods before Harkins turned and walked away, his steps tense, his shoulders stiff. Marcus watched him go, feeling a familiar weight settle on his chest. He had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that he could leave these experiences behind. But here it was, as present as ever, a reminder of the unspoken lines that still divided people. He turned back to his book, his fingers brushing the cover as he reopened to the page he'd left off on. But now the words seemed blurred, their meaning lost in the swirl of thoughts that filled his mind. It was just a simple encounter in the park. But Marcus knew that it was also something far more complex, something deeply rooted and difficult to shake. He leaned back on the bench, exhaling slowly, and let the sun's warmth sink into his skin. This was just the beginning, he sensed. The day, his peace, and maybe even his work would be intertwined with this moment for longer than he had anticipated. As Marcus handed over his ID, Harkins took it, his eyes flickering to the name and title before him. Marcus Davis, FBI Special Agent. The officer's face shifted ever so slightly, a glimmer of surprise flashing in his eyes. But just as quickly, he masked it, straightening his posture. "Agent Davis," he said, his voice momentarily faltering before regaining its assertiveness. "Thank you for your cooperation." Marcus met his gaze without a hint of resentment. Instead, there was only the steady calm that had become his armor, his way of moving through the world. "Of course, officer," Marcus replied evenly. "Just doing my part." As Harkins handed back his ID, Marcus could see the reluctance in the officer's expression, as though he wanted to say something more but couldn't find the words. Marcus took his ID back, placing it gently into his pocket, and offered the faintest of nods before Harkins turned and walked away, his steps tense, his shoulders stiff. Marcus watched him go, feeling a familiar weight settle on his chest. He had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that he could leave these experiences behind. But here it was, as present as ever, a reminder of the unspoken lines that still divided people. He turned back to his book, his fingers brushing the cover as he reopened to the page he'd left off on. But now the words seemed blurred, their meaning lost in the swirl of thoughts that filled his mind. It was just a simple encounter in the park. But Marcus knew that it was also something far more complex, something deeply rooted and difficult to shake. He leaned back on the bench, exhaling slowly, and let the sun's warmth sink into his skin. This was just the beginning, he sensed. The day, his peace, and maybe even his work would be intertwined with this moment for longer than he had anticipated. It was a demand, not a request, and Marcus felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. He could feel the eyes of the people around them, witnesses to an encounter that seemed so unnecessary, yet so familiar. He knew, just as he had known the moment Harkins had first approached him, that this wasn't about a simple search. It was about power and authority, exercised over someone who Harkins had already deemed untrustworthy. Marcus inhaled deeply, summoning the patience he'd built over years of experiences just like this one. "Officer," he began carefully, choosing his words with deliberate calm, "I've shown you my ID. You're well aware of who I am." "That doesn't change anything," Harkins snapped back, his voice sharper now. I still need to be sure. Sure of what? Marcus wanted to ask, but he held his tongue. He understood that arguing would likely escalate the situation in ways that wouldn't serve him. Instead, he gave a single nod, loosening the strap of his shoulder bag and extending it toward the officer. His eyes, however, held Harkins's with a steady, unwavering gaze. Harkins took the bag, his movements abrupt, as though he were expecting resistance. He unzipped the bag with a purpose that bordered on aggression, rooting through Marcus's personal belongings in a way that felt invasive and dehumanizing. Marcus stood still, his hands at his sides, resisting the urge to clench his fists. He could feel the silent judgment of onlookers, the curiosity, and the whispers as they observed the scene. The sense of public scrutiny was an unwelcome addition to the ordeal. After a few minutes of searching, Harkins found nothing of interest and finally returned the bag, though he held on to it a moment longer than necessary, as though reluctant to admit he'd found nothing to justify his suspicions. Marcus took the bag back, giving the officer a measured look. I hope that settles things, Officer Harkins, he said, his tone carrying a slight edge now. It was a subtle assertion, a way of drawing a line without crossing it himself. Harkins opened his mouth to respond, but a voice interrupted before he could speak. Excuse me, is there a problem here? Marcus turned to see a woman approaching, her uniform and poised expression indicating her role as a captain within the local police department. Her name badge read Captain Laura Bennett, and Marcus immediately sensed her authority and awareness of protocol. Harkins stiffened at the sight of her, his demeanor changing instantly. He looked down, as though caught in the act, and Marcus could see the discomfort flicker across his face. No, ma'am, Harkins replied, the sharpness in his tone replaced by an almost forced respect. Captain Bennett's eyes shifted from Harkins to Marcus, her gaze assessing, but not judgmental. She took in the scene, her expression cool and unreadable. I'm Captain Bennett. Can you tell me what's going on here, officer? Bennett, can you tell me what's going on here, officer? Harkins fumbled for an explanation, clearly caught off guard. I was just performing a routine check, ma'am, he said, his words stumbling slightly. Agent Davis here. Agent Davis? Captain Bennett's eyebrows raised slightly as she looked at Marcus with renewed interest. Marcus nodded, extending his hand. Yes, ma'am, Marcus Davis, FBI. There was a calm firmness in his voice, and he offered a small, respectful nod as Bennett shook his hand. Captain Bennett gave a brief nod, her expression softening, and then she turned back to Harkins. A routine check, you say, on a fellow officer? Her tone was neutral, but Marcus could sense the underlying challenge. Harkins faltered, his face reddening. I thought he fit a profile, ma'am, he said, his voice barely above a whisper now. Captain Bennett's gaze hardened, a subtle shift that spoke volumes. She looked back at Marcus, who stood silently, his calm demeanor unbroken despite the tension that hung in the air. Well, it appears this matter is settled, Officer Harkins, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She turned to Marcus, giving him a polite nod. I apologize on behalf of our department, Agent Davis. You're free to enjoy your day without any further interruptions. Marcus returned the nod, appreciating the gesture. Thank you, Captain Bennett, he replied, his voice carrying a note of genuine gratitude. Captain Bennett gestured for Harkins to follow her, and Marcus watched as they walked away, her quiet reprimand clear in her firm steps. The situation was over, but Marcus knew it wasn't really over. Not for him, and perhaps not for Officer Harkins either. As he resumed his walk, Marcus's thoughts drifted, not toward anger, but toward reflection. This was just another reminder of the silent battles he and others like him fought every day. Battles fought not with fists, but with patience and dignity. And as he left the park, he resolved once more that no matter the injustice, he would continue to hold his head high, even if it meant standing alone. He knew now that this encounter would ripple beyond today, sparking a chain of events neither he nor Harkins could have anticipated. The following morning, Marcus was back in his office at the FBI Field Division, still replaying the previous day's events in his mind. He knew encounters like that left marks, invisible to most, but felt deeply by those who lived them. Though he'd initially thought he could shake it off, the memory lingered, settling into his thoughts like an uninvited guest. Just as he settled into his chair, His phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the number, one he didn't recognize, but something told him it wasn't a routine call. With a sigh, he picked it up. "Agent Davis speaking," he answered, his voice steady, masking any hint of frustration. "Agent Davis, this is Captain Laura Bennett from the police department," came the familiar voice on the other end. Her tone was professional, carrying a faint edge of something unspoken. "I wanted to reach out regarding yesterday's incident in the park." Marcus straightened slightly, his fingers tightening around the receiver. "Yes, Captain Bennett. I appreciate you stepping in." Captain Bennett paused, and Marcus could almost imagine her gathering her thoughts, weighing her words carefully. "I'm reaching out because we're conducting an internal review of Officer Harkins's conduct. I believe it's necessary, given his approach and the circumstances." There was a moment of silence as Marcus processed her words. It wasn't entirely surprising, considering the tension he'd sensed in her when she had arrived at the scene. But her proactive decision to investigate Harkins struck him as unusual, especially given the unspoken solidarity often found in law enforcement circles. "I appreciate your dedication to looking into it, Captain," Marcus replied, his tone reflecting genuine respect. "It's not an easy subject to address." Bennett exhaled quietly, a sound that was almost a sigh. "No, it's not. But I believe it's necessary. This kind of behavior doesn't just harm those who experience it. It damages trust in our department as a whole." Marcus was silent, absorbing her words. He hadn't expected this level of transparency, but he welcomed it. Perhaps this incident could lead to something greater than the injustice he'd endured. "I would like to meet with you, Agent Davis," Captain Bennett continued. "If you're open to it, I believe your perspective could help us understand the broader implications of what happened, and I think it's time we started addressing the biases that exist within our ranks." Marcus felt a spark of hope, tempered by caution. He knew change was difficult and often met with resistance, but Captain Bennett's willingness to involve him, a federal agent who had experienced the department's flaws firsthand, suggested a desire for genuine reform. "I'd be willing to meet, Captain," he replied, his voice steady. "If there's a chance to make some real changes, I'm all in." "Thank you, Agent Davis," she said, relief evident in her tone. "Let's arrange a meeting for tomorrow at 10 a.m., here at the precinct. I'd like for us to discuss ways to improve our training programs and address the underlying issues." As he hung up, Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The gravity of the situation hadn't escaped him. He knew this conversation could spark changes that extended beyond himself and Officer Harkins. It was a small step, but it felt meaningful, a chance to confront the biases that too often went unchallenged within the system. The next day, Marcus arrived at the precinct right on time. The air was tense, filled with the sounds of officers and staff moving through their daily routines, punctuated by the occasional radio chatter. Captain Bennett was waiting for him near the entrance, her expression serious but welcoming. "Agent Davis," she greeted him with a firm handshake. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for reaching out, Captain," Marcus replied, meeting her gaze. She led him to a small conference room where they settled into seats across from each other. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a shared understanding that this was no ordinary meeting. "I want you to know," Captain Bennett began, her voice steady but sincere, "that this isn't just about Officer Harkins. I believe his actions reflect a larger problem within the department, one that I've tried to address but haven't been able to fully confront. Biases, both conscious and unconscious, are more deeply ingrained than many of us are willing to admit." Marcus nodded, appreciating her honesty. "I've seen it myself, both in the field and in situations like the one we faced yesterday. It's not just a problem within this department. It's something that exists across our institutions, but addressing it here could set an important example." Captain Bennett seemed to consider his words, nodding thoughtfully. "That's what I hope. This isn't just about punishment. It's about reform. We need to rebuild trust, not just within our team but with the community as well." She leaned forward, her hands folded on the table. "If you're open to it, I'd like you to share your perspective with our training teams. They need to hear about what it's like to experience that bias from within the law enforcement community. We can mandate training on paper, But without real stories, real experiences, I'm not sure we'll be able to create lasting change. Marcus felt a surge of resolve. I'd be willing to do that, Captain. It's not easy to relive those experiences, but if it helps create a shift in mindset, then it's worth it. Captain Bennett's face softened, a faint smile crossing her features. Thank you, Agent Davis. I believe this could be the start of something meaningful. But just so you're aware, this isn't going to be easy. There are those in the department who won't take well to this initiative. Marcus nodded, understanding her caution. I'm prepared for that. Change isn't easy, but if it's the right thing to do, it's worth the challenges that come with it. Their conversation continued, delving into ideas for practical changes within the training program. They discussed implementing workshops on implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and the importance of respect and empathy in law enforcement interactions. Marcus shared his experiences, giving Captain Bennett a glimpse into the daily reality faced by those subjected to biases based on race and appearance. As their meeting came to a close, Marcus felt a sense of cautious optimism. He knew the road ahead would be long and met with resistance, but there was something powerful in knowing that there were others, like Captain Bennett, who were committed to the same ideals. As they stood to leave, Captain Bennett extended her hand once more. Thank you for your honesty and your willingness to help us, Agent Davis. This may not be an easy journey, but it's one I believe is necessary. Marcus shook her hand, meeting her gaze with determination. Thank you for reaching out, Captain. I look forward to working together. Leaving the precinct, Marcus felt a strange mixture of emotions. Hope, caution, and a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in a long time, he felt like change was within reach, even if it was only the first step. He knew there would be more difficult conversations, more resistance, and likely more moments like the one he'd experienced in the park. But if he could help create a safer, more equitable environment, then every step of the journey would be worth it. As he walked down the steps of the precinct, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. This was only the beginning, but it was a beginning with promise. The days following Marcus's meeting with Captain Bennett were marked by a quiet tension within the precinct. Word of the investigation into Officer Harkins had spread, and while most officers carried on with their duties, there was an unmistakable shift in the atmosphere. Some were skeptical, wondering aloud if this was just another attempt at political correctness or bureaucratic red tape. Others, however, seemed genuinely interested, acknowledging, at least in private, that biases were affecting their work. As Marcus prepared to address a training group for the first time, he was met with mixed reactions from his fellow agents at the FBI. While a few colleagues offered him words of encouragement, others voiced their doubts. So, you're really going to the police department to talk about bias? Asked Agent Colin Myers, one of Marcus's colleagues who had a reputation for his straightforward, often unfiltered, comments. His tone was casual, but there was a hint of judgment underlying it. That's the plan, Marcus replied, keeping his response brief. Colin leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. You think it's actually going to change anything? I mean, we all know this kind of thing happens, but isn't it just part of the job? Marcus took a moment, choosing his words carefully. Just because it happens often doesn't mean it should. If we let bias influence our decisions, we're failing the people we're supposed to protect. Colin shrugged, seemingly unimpressed. Maybe. But good luck convincing a room full of cops that they're the ones who need to change. Marcus smiled faintly, unbothered by Colin's cynicism. I'm not trying to convince anyone that they're bad people. I'm just hoping to help them see things from a different perspective. That evening, Marcus found himself preparing for the session he was scheduled to lead the next day. He knew that sharing his experiences would open up his vulnerabilities, exposing him to criticism, but he also understood that true change required honesty. The next morning, Marcus entered the training room at the precinct. The space was modest, with rows of chairs arranged to face a small podium. Officers and staff were scattered throughout the room, some leaning back with folded arms, others engaged in quiet conversation. Captain Bennett stood near the entrance, her expression warm but professional. Agent Davis, thank you for being here. She greeted him with a handshake, her tone carrying an unspoken assurance that she had his back. "Thank you for the opportunity, Captain," Marcus replied, nodding respectfully before stepping up to the podium. The room quieted as he began to speak, his calm, steady voice drawing the attention of everyone present. "I want to start by saying that I'm not here to accuse anyone of being prejudiced or to question anyone's integrity," Marcus began, his eyes scanning the room. "I understand that law enforcement is a challenging field, and I respect the dedication of every officer in this room." He paused, taking a breath. "But I also want to talk about something that often goes unspoken in our line of work. How our biases, both conscious and unconscious, can affect the way we carry out our duties." The room remained silent, a few faces showing signs of skepticism, others looking away as though to avoid any uncomfortable eye contact. Marcus pressed on, recounting his experience in the park with Officer Harkins, leaving out no details. The suspicion in Harkins' eyes, the humiliation of having his belongings searched, the quiet judgments from bystanders. He spoke not with anger, but with a candid honesty that was impossible to ignore. As he described the encounter, Marcus noticed a shift in the room. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, their expressions softening as they listened to his story. "This isn't just about one bad day or one difficult encounter," he continued. "This is about how we see the people we're sworn to protect. It's about remembering that each person we interact with, regardless of appearance or background, deserves our respect and our patience." After he finished speaking, Captain Bennett stepped up to the podium, thanking Marcus before opening the floor for questions and comments. There was a moment of silence as people absorbed what they had heard, until one officer, a woman named Officer Rivera, raised her hand. "Agent Davis, thank you for sharing your story," she said, her voice carrying a genuine respect. "I think it's important that we're talking about this. I've seen similar situations myself, and I know it's something we all need to be more mindful of." Marcus nodded, a sense of gratitude filling him. Officer Rivera's words felt like a small but meaningful victory, a sign that some of his message had resonated. However, not everyone was as receptive. Another officer, a tall man with a hardened expression, leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed. "Look, I get that bias is a problem," he said, his voice edged with skepticism. "But how are we supposed to do our jobs if we're constantly second-guessing ourselves? We're out there risking our lives, and sometimes we don't have time to analyze every little decision." Marcus looked at the man calmly, understanding his frustration. "I'm not suggesting we abandon our instincts or hesitate in dangerous situations," he replied. "But there's a difference between following your instincts and letting your biases dictate your actions. If we take a moment to reflect on our own assumptions, we might find that some of our initial judgments aren't always fair." Captain Bennett stepped in, her tone firm but empathetic. "We're not asking anyone to ignore the realities of the job, but we do have a responsibility to ensure that those realities don't compromise our integrity." The room fell silent once more, and Marcus could see the gears turning in many of their minds. It wasn't a complete victory. He hadn't won over everyone, nor had he expected to. But he could see that he had planted a seed, sparking a conversation that wouldn't easily be forgotten. As the session wrapped up, several officers approached Marcus, thanking him for his openness and sharing their own experiences. Some spoke quietly of encounters that had made them question their own judgments, moments where they'd caught themselves relying on stereotypes rather than facts. Each story, each confession, was a reminder to Marcus that change was possible, even if it came in small steps. Outside the room, Captain Bennett approached Marcus, her expression thoughtful. "You did well in there, Agent Davis. I think you made a real impact." Marcus nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Thank you, Captain. It's a start, but I know we've got a long way to go." Bennett sighed, glancing down the hall where the officers had dispersed. "Progress isn't always easy or quick, but it's worth the effort. And I want you to know, you're not alone in this. I'll be doing my part to ensure this isn't just a one-time conversation." Her words reassured him, filling him with a renewed sense of purpose. As he left the precinct, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with resistance, but it was a path he was willing to walk. There was a new momentum in place, and he was determined to see it through. The conversations he'd started, the awareness he'd sparked, and the allies he'd gained along the way, all of it was proof that change was within reach. And as he headed back to his own office, he knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that was far from over. A week after his session with the officers, Marcus returned to his daily work routine. Yet the events in the precinct weighed on his mind. His conversation with Captain Bennett had solidified a sense of purpose within him, but he knew that true change would require much more than a few training sessions. One afternoon, as Marcus was preparing a report, he received an email from Captain Bennett. The subject line read, "Important update." Curious, he opened it and read the message. "Agent Davis, I wanted to inform you that the Internal Review Board has decided to move forward with formal disciplinary action against Officer Harkins. He has been placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. We're anticipating both internal support and external scrutiny, so please be prepared for possible fallout. Thank you for your continued dedication. Captain Laura Bennett." The news brought a sense of relief but also apprehension. He knew this decision would stir up tensions, both within the department and the broader community. For some, the action taken against Harkins would represent progress. For others, it would be seen as a threat to tradition or camaraderie within the force. Change, Marcus reminded himself, was never easy. The following morning, Marcus received a call from Captain Bennett. "Agent Davis," she began, her tone unusually cautious. "I wanted to give you a heads up. There's been some backlash among a few officers regarding Harkins's suspension. Some feel it was too severe and that it's setting a dangerous precedent." Marcus listened, unshaken. He had expected resistance, but hearing it confirmed was unsettling. "I understand, Captain, but we both know this action is necessary. We can't allow this kind of behavior to go unaddressed." "You're absolutely right," Bennett replied. "But be prepared. I'm afraid it might get personal. Some officers have a way of retaliating, directly or indirectly, and I want you to be aware of that." Her words lingered in his mind long after the conversation ended. Marcus was no stranger to conflict, but the idea of facing hostility from fellow law enforcement officers weighed heavily on him. Still, he reminded himself that this was precisely why he had chosen this path, to confront and address the biases that had gone unchecked for too long. Later that day, Marcus attended a meeting at the precinct with Captain Bennett and a group of senior officers to discuss the department's next steps. Bennett had introduced new de-escalation and bias awareness training programs, emphasizing the importance of fair and respectful interactions. But the atmosphere in the room was tense, marked by a few skeptical glares and murmured objections. As Captain Bennett outlined the new measures, one senior officer, Lieutenant Graham, raised his hand. Graham was known for his blunt, old-school approach, and he wasn't shy about voicing his skepticism. "With all due respect, Captain, aren't we putting too much focus on this bias thing?" Graham asked, his tone bordering on confrontational. "We're here to uphold the law, not to cater to people's feelings. If someone looks suspicious, we have to act, not second-guess ourselves because of some training session." Marcus exchanged a quick look with Bennett, who nodded for him to respond. Marcus took a deep breath before addressing Graham directly. "Lieutenant, I understand your concerns," Marcus began, keeping his tone respectful but firm. "But this isn't about ignoring suspicion or being soft. It's about ensuring that our decisions are based on behavior and evidence, not assumptions rooted in personal bias." Graham narrowed his eyes, unimpressed. "With all due respect, Agent Davis, you don't know what it's like out there on the streets every day. We don't have time to analyze every single action." Marcus met his gaze, unwavering. "I do understand, Lieutenant. I've faced these situations myself, and I know how difficult it can be. But I also know that making split-second judgments based on bias can lead to tragic mistakes. This training isn't about slowing you down. It's about equipping you to make better, more informed decisions." A few officers nodded quietly, and Marcus felt a sense of solidarity from some of the more junior members who seemed receptive to the message. Captain Bennett, recognizing the need to diffuse the tension, stepped in. "This is a challenging issue, and I respect everyone's concerns," she said. but we have a duty to uphold the values we stand for, which includes respecting every member of our community. I'm confident that this training will ultimately benefit us all." The meeting wrapped up shortly after, and as the officers began to file out, Marcus noticed Graham lingering, watching him with a look that held a mixture of resentment and curiosity. Marcus offered a nod, but Graham simply turned and walked away without acknowledging him. Over the following days, Marcus encountered small but undeniable signs of resistance. Colleagues who had once greeted him warmly now offered curt nods or avoided eye contact altogether. Some officers muttered remarks under their breath as he passed, comments that stung but that he chose to ignore. The change in atmosphere was palpable, yet Marcus held his ground, refusing to let the resistance deter him. One afternoon, he received an unexpected visitor in his office. Officer Rivera, the young woman who had spoken up during his training session, knocked on his door and entered, her expression uncertain but determined. "Agent Davis, do you have a moment?" she asked, her tone respectful but hesitant. "Of course, Officer Rivera. Please, take a seat," Marcus replied, gesturing to the chair across from him. She sat down, fidgeting slightly before speaking. "I just wanted to say thank you for what you're doing. I know it's not easy, especially with, well, the pushback you've been getting." Marcus smiled faintly, appreciating her candor. "Thank you, Rivera. I know not everyone agrees with me, but that's part of the process. Change isn't supposed to be easy." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I wanted you to know that some of us, more than you might realize, support you. We see the need for this. I think it's just that some officers, they're afraid of what change might mean for them." Her words resonated with Marcus. He understood that fear of the unknown, the discomfort that came with questioning long-held beliefs. "I appreciate that, Rivera. It means a lot to know I'm not alone in this." They spoke for a few more minutes, discussing her own experiences and the challenges she had faced as a young minority woman in law enforcement. Marcus listened intently, grateful for her openness and honesty. By the time she left, he felt a renewed sense of determination. Officer Rivera's support reminded him that there were allies within the ranks, even if they weren't always visible. The days turned into weeks, and while Marcus continued to face resistance, he also noticed small but significant changes. More officers began participating actively in the new training sessions, and conversations about bias and accountability started to emerge among colleagues. It was slow progress, but progress nonetheless. One afternoon, Captain Bennett called him into her office, her expression both serious and hopeful. "Agent Davis, I thought you'd like to know that the department's morale survey results came in this morning," she said, sliding a folder across the desk. "There's been a marked increase in officers who feel that the department is making positive strides toward inclusivity and respect." Marcus opened the folder, scanning the results. It was a small victory, but one that filled him with pride. Captain Bennett watched him, her expression thoughtful. "You've done good work here, Marcus," she said quietly. "I know it hasn't been easy, but the impact is real." Marcus met her gaze, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you, Captain. None of this would have been possible without your support." As he left her office, Marcus allowed himself a moment of reflection. The journey had been challenging, fraught with resistance and moments of doubt. But each step, each conversation had brought him closer to the goal of creating a department rooted in fairness and accountability. There was still a long road ahead, but with allies like Captain Bennett and Officer Rivera by his side, Marcus knew that meaningful change was within reach. Several weeks had passed since the introduction of the new training programs, and while progress was slow, Marcus could feel the shift in the precinct. The atmosphere was still tense, but officers were engaging in quieter conversations, hesitating for a moment longer before making snap judgments, and most importantly, beginning to reflect. But Marcus knew that this journey had to go beyond the station's walls. If they were serious about building trust, they needed to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community they served. One Friday morning, Marcus and Captain Bennett were called to a meeting with the police commissioner. When they arrived, they were greeted by Commissioner Andrew Lowell, a veteran officer with a reputation for pragmatism and dedication. Lowell was a tall, imposing figure with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. However, Marcus noticed an unexpected warmth in his greeting. "Captain Bennett, Agent Davis," the commissioner began, gesturing for them to sit. "I've been following your work, and I'm impressed with the steps you're taking. We need this kind of change if we're going to build a foundation of trust with our community." Captain Bennett smiled, encouraged by his support. "Thank you, Commissioner. It's been challenging, but we're committed to seeing this through." The commissioner leaned forward, clasping his hands. "We have a community outreach event coming up. A town hall meeting. Representatives from the neighborhoods most affected by our department's actions will be there. I'd like the two of you to attend and share what you're doing here. If we want the community to support us, they need to see that we're serious about making changes." Marcus exchanged a quick glance with Bennett, sensing the importance of this opportunity. "We'd be honored to participate, Commissioner. I believe hearing from us directly might help ease some of the tensions." Lowell nodded, his gaze sharp and thoughtful. "Just be prepared for some strong opinions. There are people who've been hurt by our system, and their frustrations are valid. I trust you'll handle it well." As they left the commissioner's office, Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The town hall would be their chance to engage directly with the community, but he knew they would likely face intense scrutiny and difficult questions. This was uncharted territory, and the stakes were high. The evening of the town hall arrived, and the event was held at a community center in the heart of the city. The room was filled with a diverse group of residents, ranging from young activists to seasoned community leaders, parents, students, and everyday citizens who had gathered to voice their concerns and hear from their local law enforcement. As Marcus and Bennett took their seats on the stage, the moderator introduced them, explaining the purpose of the meeting. The atmosphere was charged, and Marcus could feel the weight of anticipation in the air. Many in the audience wore expressions of skepticism, some even resentment. The first half of the meeting was focused on listening. One by one, community members approached the microphone to share their stories, experiences of being profiled, unjustly detained, or even witnessing violence at the hands of law enforcement. Some spoke in measured tones, while others allowed their anger and pain to spill out in raw emotion. Marcus listened intently, his heart heavy as he absorbed their stories. He could see Captain Bennett beside him, her expression firm yet compassionate as she took in the accounts with an open mind. Finally, it was their turn to speak. Captain Bennett stepped up first, beginning with a statement of empathy and respect. "I want to thank each of you for being here tonight and for sharing your stories," she began. "I know many of you have suffered as a result of our actions, and that pain is real. I won't pretend that anything I say here tonight can erase the past, but I do promise you this: we're committed to making meaningful changes." She spoke about the new initiatives, the training programs, and the increased focus on de-escalation and bias awareness. But even as she outlined these steps, Marcus could see the skeptical glances exchanged among some audience members. When she finished, she turned to Marcus, signaling him to take the podium. Marcus took a steadying breath before he spoke, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "My name is Marcus Davis, and I'm an FBI agent. But tonight, I'm not here in that capacity. I'm here as a human being, as a black man, and as someone who has been on both sides of this divide." His words seemed to resonate, and a quiet settled over the room. He shared his experience with Officer Harkins, recounting the details with the same openness he had shown during the training sessions at the precinct. But this time, the audience reacted differently. Gasps, murmurs, and even a few sighs filled the room as he described the humiliation and anger he had felt. "I'm not here to justify what happened, nor am I here to ask for your forgiveness on behalf of those who've wronged you," he continued. "But I do believe that if we're going to create a safer, fairer environment, we need to work together. We need your voices, your experiences, and yes, your criticisms to help guide us." A woman in the audience, visibly moved, raised her hand. "But how do we know this isn't just another empty promise?" she asked, her voice tinged with both hope and doubt. "We've been let down before. How do we know this will be any different?" Marcus met her gaze, his expression earnest. "The truth is, you don't. But actions speak louder than words, and I'm asking you to hold us accountable. This process won't be easy and it won't be perfect, but if we're serious about change, then we'll continue to show up, listen, and adapt. His response seemed to strike a chord, and for the first time that evening, a few audience members nodded in agreement. Over the course of the next hour, Marcus and Bennett fielded questions, many of them difficult and challenging. Some people remained skeptical, while others cautiously expressed their support. But by the end of the meeting, Marcus felt a sense of accomplishment. It was clear that trust would not be rebuilt overnight, but they had taken an important step forward. As the meeting concluded and the crowd began to disperse, a young man approached Marcus. He wore a hooded sweatshirt and had a wary look in his eyes, but his voice was calm. "I appreciate what you said up there," the young man said, his gaze steady. "I've been on the other end of those interactions more times than I can count, and honestly, I don't trust most cops. But if you're willing to put in the work, maybe I can give this a chance." Marcus extended his hand, and the young man hesitated before accepting the handshake. "Thank you," Marcus replied, his voice filled with sincerity. "I promise you, we're going to keep working on this." As the young man walked away, Marcus turned to Captain Bennett, who was watching the exchange with a quiet smile. "It's a start," she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "We may not have won everyone over, but we're building a bridge." Marcus nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. One person at a time, one conversation at a time. That's how we create real change. As they left the community center, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, but it was accompanied by a spark of hope. The journey ahead would be challenging, filled with setbacks and resistance, but the events of that evening had shown him that change was possible. He had seen firsthand the impact of openness, empathy, and accountability, and he was determined to continue fostering those values within the force. The road would be long, and the obstacles many, but Marcus was ready to face them. With allies like Captain Bennett by his side and the support of the community behind him, he felt confident that, step by step, they were moving closer to a better, more just future. The positive impact of the town hall event lingered, with word spreading quickly through the community. Over the next few weeks, Marcus and Captain Bennett received calls from local leaders and civil rights advocates, expressing their cautious support. A few even reached out, asking to be involved in future reform discussions. Marcus felt a growing sense of optimism. Small changes were beginning to take root, and while many challenges remained, he believed they were on the right path. But as the community began to rally behind their efforts, the resistance within the precinct grew more vocal. Every day, Marcus could feel the tension building, especially from officers who felt that the new policies were undermining their authority. Lieutenant Graham in particular had become increasingly vocal, challenging Marcus at every turn. One morning, Marcus arrived at the precinct to find a flyer taped to his office door. It read, in bold, block letters, "You might be one of us, but you're no brother." Marcus froze, the words striking a painful chord. He knew this wasn't just a personal attack. It was a clear signal that his efforts were seen as a betrayal by some within the department. Captain Bennett was immediately informed, and she looked at Marcus with a mix of sympathy and anger. "We won't let this go unaddressed, Marcus," she said firmly. "No one should feel threatened or isolated for doing the right thing." But Marcus shook his head, his expression resolute. "I expected this, Captain. It's not going to scare me off. But it does tell me that we're making a dent, and that's exactly why they're reacting this way." Despite his outward confidence, the message weighed heavily on Marcus. He knew that true change required allies and a united front. The more isolated he felt, the harder it would be to maintain momentum. However, he soon discovered that not everyone in the precinct shared the same hostility. Later that afternoon, Officer Rivera stopped by his office. She looked around, checking to make sure they were alone, before stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "Agent Davis, I heard what happened. I just wanted you to know that there are more of us who believe in what you're doing than you might think," she said, her voice low but firm. Marcus looked up, surprised by her support. "Thank you, Rivera. It means a lot to know I'm not alone in this." She hesitated before continuing. I've been talking to a few of the younger officers, and they're on board with the changes. They see the need for reform. Even if some of the veterans don't, we're not in a position to make big waves. But we're here, and we're behind you." Her words brought Marcus a sense of reassurance. Knowing that there were others within the department who shared his vision gave him a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that Rivera and the younger officers could be powerful allies, helping to bridge the divide within the precinct. Together, they began to organize informal meetings with officers who were open to the changes. The group was small at first, but it steadily grew, with officers from diverse backgrounds who understood the importance of a fair and unbiased police force. They shared stories, discussed their experiences, and brainstormed ways to implement the new policies more effectively. Captain Bennett, observing the growth of their coalition, offered her support as well, ensuring that these meetings remained safe and productive spaces. She reminded them all that while the path ahead would be difficult, it was essential work if they wanted to rebuild trust with the community. One night, as Marcus was leaving the precinct, he spotted Lieutenant Graham waiting near the parking lot. Graham had his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of anger and something darker. "Davis?" he called out as Marcus approached. "Got a minute?" Marcus hesitated, sensing the hostility, but he stood his ground. "What is it, Lieutenant?" Graham stepped closer, lowering his voice but keeping it menacing. "You've got some nerve coming in here and trying to tell us how to do our jobs. We've been keeping this city safe long before you came along. All these new rules, they're just going to get people hurt." Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. "Change isn't easy, Graham, but protecting people means more than just keeping crime down. It means treating everyone fairly, with respect. That's the job." Graham sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Maybe that's your job. But don't think for a second you can change how we operate. You're just one man. This is a war you can't win." Without another word, Graham turned and walked away, leaving Marcus alone in the dimly lit parking lot. The confrontation left him unsettled, but he reminded himself of the progress he'd already made, of the community members who had come forward in support, and of the officers who were willing to fight alongside him. The tension within the department continued to simmer, reaching a boiling point one afternoon during a routine patrol briefing. Captain Bennett was discussing new de-escalation protocols when Graham interrupted, his tone openly defiant. "With all due respect, Captain, these protocols are a waste of time," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "We're out there risking our lives every day. We don't need more rules tying our hands." Captain Bennett held his gaze, her tone calm but authoritative. "Lieutenant, these protocols are designed to protect both the officers and the community. They're not optional, and they're backed by the commissioner himself." But Graham wasn't backing down. He glanced around the room, his eyes landing on several officers who shared his perspective. Maybe the commissioner should come down here and walk a beat himself. See what it's really like out there. The room fell silent, and Marcus could feel the tension thickening. This was a direct challenge, not only to the new policies, but to everything he and Captain Bennett had been working toward. Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "I understand that change is hard, but our job is to serve and protect everyone, not just those we choose to. These protocols aren't about making our jobs harder. They're about making our jobs better." A murmur went through the room, with some officers nodding in agreement while others exchanged skeptical glances. Graham rolled his eyes but said nothing further, choosing instead to glare at Marcus before leaving the room. After the meeting, Captain Bennett pulled Marcus aside. "That was a bold move, standing up to him like that," she said, a note of admiration in her voice. "But I worry that Graham's resistance might push some of the other officers to follow him." Marcus nodded, understanding her concern. "We need to keep building alliances, both in the precinct and in the community. Graham may have his supporters, but I believe more people are open to change than he realizes." The next day, Marcus received an unexpected message from a local community leader, Reverend Elijah Turner. Reverend Turner was a prominent figure known for his work in social justice and his commitment to advocating for marginalized communities. He had heard about the town hall event and wanted to meet with Marcus to discuss the precinct's reform efforts. When they met at the Reverend's office, Marcus found himself welcomed by a man with a warm smile and an unwavering gaze. "Agent Davis," Reverend Turner greeted him, offering a firm handshake. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I've heard about the work you're doing, and I must say, I'm impressed. But I also know that these changes are just the beginning." Marcus nodded, feeling a deep respect for the Reverend's wisdom. "You're right, Reverend. We've made progress, but there's still a long way to go. I wanted to reach out to leaders like you because we need the community's voice in this process." The Reverend nodded thoughtfully, his expression serious. "Building trust takes time, and there are wounds that run deep. But I believe that if we work together, we can start to heal those wounds. I'd like to invite you to speak at one of our community meetings, to share your vision and give people a chance to hear directly from you." Marcus felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Reverend Turner. I'd be honored. I want the community to know that we're not just talking about change, we're taking action." As they discussed plans for the upcoming meeting, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The Reverend's support was a powerful asset, and he knew that with allies like him, they could create a bridge between the community and law enforcement that would stand the test of time. But even as he prepared for the meeting, he knew that his greatest challenge lay within the precinct. Winning the trust of the community was essential, but until he could bring more of his fellow officers on board, the changes would remain fragile. The days ahead would be filled with tough conversations, difficult decisions, and unwavering commitment. Marcus steeled himself, determined to press forward. The road was long, but for the first time he could see the possibility of real lasting change on the horizon. The community meeting organized by Reverend Turner was set for a Thursday evening, and as the day approached, Marcus felt both excitement and anxiety. This was a crucial opportunity not just for him, but for the entire precinct to demonstrate their commitment to change. He prepared diligently, crafting his message to resonate with the community's concerns while emphasizing the need for collaboration moving forward. On the evening of the meeting, the venue was packed. Residents filled the community center, the atmosphere buzzing with anticipation. Reverend Turner opened the session, welcoming attendees and emphasizing the importance of dialogue between law enforcement and the community. "Tonight, we have the opportunity to listen, to share, and to build bridges," he proclaimed, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "I've invited Agent Marcus Davis to speak with us about the changes underway in our police force. Let us hear from him directly." As Marcus took the stage, he felt the weight of many eyes upon him, each one carrying a story, a concern, and an expectation. He stepped to the microphone, inhaling deeply to steady himself. "Thank you, Reverend Turner, and thank you all for being here tonight," Marcus began, scanning the crowd. "I stand before you not just as an agent of the FBI, but as someone who deeply cares about this community and the officers who serve it. I know that many of you have experienced pain and distrust because of past actions, and I am here to say that we are committed to changing that." He spoke about the new initiatives being implemented within the precinct, detailing the training on racial bias and de-escalation techniques. He shared the stories of his own experiences, drawing parallels between his life and the struggles faced by many in the audience. As he spoke, he noticed a few heads nodding in agreement, while others remained skeptical. When he finished, he opened the floor for questions, prepared to face whatever concerns would be raised. One elderly woman stood up, her voice quivering. "You say you're committed to change, but how do we know this won't just be more empty promises?" she asked, her eyes searching his for sincerity. Marcus felt the weight of her question. "I understand your skepticism, and I don't blame you for feeling that way. The truth is, change is a process, and it will take time. But I ask you to hold us accountable. If we fail to deliver, you have every right to call us out." Her gaze softened slightly, but skepticism still lingered. The conversation continued, with various community members expressing their concerns, frustrations, and hopes for the future. Each question challenged Marcus, forcing him to confront the harsh realities that the police had created in the community. But rather than feeling defeated, he grew more resolute. By the end of the meeting, as people began to leave, Marcus felt a sense of accomplishment. Many residents approached him to thank him for his honesty and openness, and a few even shared their stories with him personally, eager to connect. As he stepped down from the stage, Reverend Turner joined him, a proud smile on his face. "You did well, Marcus. You spoke from the heart, and that's what these folks need." "Thank you, Reverend," Marcus replied, gratitude evident in his voice. "I hope we can continue these conversations. Building trust is going to take a lot of work." The following days saw the community response to the meeting ripple through the precinct. While many officers remained skeptical, Marcus and Captain Bennett were encouraged by the number of community members who were willing to reach out. They began to see the impact of their outreach efforts, and slowly, more officers started to express their support for the reforms, but not everyone was convinced. Lieutenant Graham continued to rally his supporters, spreading dissent among the ranks. It was clear to Marcus that there was a looming confrontation. The atmosphere in the precinct was charged, and he knew he had to address it head-on. One afternoon, Marcus approached Captain Bennett in her office. "I think it's time we confront the dissent in our ranks," he said, his voice firm. "Graham's rhetoric is becoming divisive, and if we don't address it, it could undermine everything we're trying to accomplish." Bennett sighed, rubbing her temples. "You're right. I've been hearing the murmurs, and it's getting louder. If we don't act, we risk alienating the officers who are on board with us. We need to have an open forum, a chance for everyone to voice their opinions and ask questions." Marcus nodded, feeling a surge of determination. "I'll help facilitate it. It's time to lay everything out on the table." The open forum was scheduled for the following week, and Marcus and Captain Bennett worked tirelessly to prepare for it. They wanted to create a safe space where officers could express their frustrations without fear of retribution, while also reinforcing the necessity of the reforms they were trying to implement. On the day of the forum, the room was filled with tension. Officers shuffled in, some wearing expressions of defiance, others looking uncertain. Marcus stood at the front of the room with Captain Bennett, determined to foster an atmosphere of open dialogue. As the meeting began, Marcus addressed the group. "Thank you all for being here today. We're in a pivotal moment in our department and community. I want to emphasize that this forum is not about blaming anyone. It's about listening, learning, and moving forward together." Graham was among the first to speak. "This is all well and good, but we're out there on the front lines every day. These new rules are going to get people hurt. We need to keep control in those situations, and I don't see how we can do that with all these new guidelines." Marcus took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I understand your concerns, Lieutenant, but controlling a situation doesn't mean exerting power through force. It means de-escalating, communicating, and ensuring everyone involved feels safe. Our goal is to protect our community and ourselves." As the forum continued, other officers voiced their frustrations, but Marcus and Captain Bennett remained composed, responding with understanding and a commitment to work together toward solutions. Slowly, he began to notice a shift in the room. Some officers were nodding along, and conversations sparked between those who had previously remained silent. But just as momentum seemed to be building, Graham interjected again, this time more aggressively. "You're all being naive if you think this will work. You'll see, this is going to blow up in our faces, and when it does, it'll be on your heads." Marcus felt the tension in the room shift, realizing that Graham's words were meant to incite fear. But instead of succumbing to the negativity, Marcus leaned into the discomfort. "Change is never easy, and it comes with risks," he said, his voice steady. "But I truly believe that by engaging with our community and treating everyone with respect, we can create a safer environment for ourselves and those we serve. It's a challenge we must be willing to embrace." The room fell into a heavy silence, and for a moment Marcus thought he had lost them. But then a young officer, Officer Lee, spoke up. "I want to support this. I've seen how we can make a difference. We just need to be willing to try." The room shifted once more, and suddenly voices began to join in. More officers started to express their willingness to adapt, sharing their own experiences of moments where de-escalation had worked in their favor. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. As the meeting came to a close, Marcus felt a sense of relief wash over him. They had weathered the storm, and while there would still be challenges ahead, they were beginning to build a united front within the precinct. Later that evening, Marcus walked outside, the weight of the day slowly lifting as he breathed in the cool evening air. Just then, his phone buzzed with a message from Reverend Turner. "You're making waves, Marcus. Keep it up. Change is coming." He smiled, feeling grateful for the support of community leaders who believed in the journey they were on. The path ahead was uncertain, but with each step, they were moving closer to a future where trust, understanding, and justice could flourish. The following weeks felt like a whirlwind of activity for Marcus and Captain Bennett. Their open forum had ignited a flicker of change within the precinct, and momentum continued to build as more officers began to express their support for the reforms. They held regular meetings, working collaboratively to fine-tune their approach to community engagement and training. Yet, amidst this progress, a palpable tension lingered in the air. The support of some officers only seemed to intensify the animosity from others, particularly from Lieutenant Graham. His dissent became increasingly vocal, and Marcus knew that a tipping point was approaching. One late afternoon, Marcus received a call from Reverend Turner, his voice grave. "Marcus, there's been an incident at the park. A young black man was shot during a confrontation with the police. They're saying it was a case of mistaken identity." Marcus felt his heart drop as he absorbed the information. "Do we know who was involved?" he asked, dread creeping into his voice. "The details are still coming in, but I heard that Officer Harkins was one of the responding officers," Reverend Turner replied. "People are angry, and rightfully so. They're gathering at the park now, and I think it's going to get out of hand if someone doesn't step in soon." "I'll be there," Marcus said, determination flooding through him. He knew that this incident could either fracture the community further or serve as a catalyst for real change. But he also understood that the response from law enforcement would be crucial. As he arrived at the park, the atmosphere was charged. A large crowd had gathered, voices raised in anger and sorrow. Marcus pushed through the throng looking for Reverend Turner. When he finally found him, the Reverend was speaking passionately to a group of community members, trying to calm them. "Please, let's not let this escalate. We need to find a way to address this peacefully," Turner implored, but his words were met with shouts of frustration. "Another black life lost to police violence," one woman yelled, tears streaming down her face. "How many more have to die?" Marcus stepped forward, raising his hands to calm the crowd. "Everyone, please, I understand your anger, your pain, and your frustration. I'm here to listen and to help. But we need to keep the conversation open and avoid violence." The crowd turned toward him, some with skepticism, others with hope. Reverend Turner nodded, encouraging the people to listen to Marcus. "I want to assure you that I, too, am angry about what happened today," Marcus continued, his voice steady. "I know the pain this community has faced, and I am committed to fighting for justice. We cannot let fear and anger drive us into further violence." A man in the crowd shouted, "But what are you going to do about it? We've heard promises before." "I understand that words alone won't heal these wounds," Marcus replied, feeling the weight of their skepticism. "But I want to work with you. Let's discuss what steps we can take to hold those responsible accountable and to ensure that this doesn't happen again." Before he could continue, someone shouted, "We need real change. We need accountability." Just then, a group of officers arrived, led by Captain Bennett. They stood at the perimeter, observing the crowd. Marcus felt a pang of anxiety as he saw the tension in the officers' postures, their hands resting on their weapons. He knew that a single misstep could lead to chaos. "Captain Bennett, I'm glad you're here," Marcus called out, hoping she could help defuse the situation. "We need to show them that we're listening and that we want to make things right." Bennett nodded, stepping forward. "Everyone, I want you to know that we are here to protect you, not to escalate the situation. We recognize that this is a moment of profound pain and anger, and we're committed to hearing your voices." But just as things seemed to be calming, a shout erupted from the back of the crowd. "Look, they're here to intimidate us!" Suddenly the crowd surged forward, voices rising in chaos as people pushed against the line of officers. Marcus felt his heart race as the scene spiraled out of control. "Everyone, please step back," Bennett shouted, her voice firm. "We're here to listen, not to harm anyone." But the crowd was too loud, too consumed by fear and anger. Some individuals began to throw objects, and Marcus watched in horror as tensions reached a breaking point. In a flash, an officer stepped forward, raising his baton. "Get back," he shouted, and the crowd recoiled in fear. Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline and instinctively stepped in front of the officer. "No," he yelled, holding up his hands. "This isn't the way. We need to de-escalate, not escalate." But the officer's eyes were wild, caught in the chaos. Marcus realized that in this moment he had to stand firm, not just as an agent, but as a human being. "Listen to me," he shouted to both the crowd and the officers. "I'm asking you all to take a breath. We can't afford to let this moment slip away. We need to talk, to listen, and to find a way forward together." Gradually, the chaos began to subside as people registered his plea. They turned their eyes toward him, uncertain but willing to listen. Marcus took a deep breath, focusing on the faces in the crowd. "Let's honor the memory of the young man who was lost today by committing ourselves to change," he urged, his voice steady. "Let's hold those accountable for their actions and ensure this community's voice is heard." As the crowd began to settle, Reverend Turner stepped beside Marcus. "This is our moment," he said quietly. "Let's not let fear dictate our actions. We can choose to channel our pain into progress." The atmosphere shifted, and people began to talk amongst themselves, some nodding in agreement. The tension in the air began to lighten as individuals started to see the possibility of constructive dialogue. Captain Bennett approached Marcus, her eyes fierce with determination. "You handled that incredibly well, Marcus. We have to follow this up with a plan for accountability. We can't let this incident be brushed aside." "I agree, Captain," Marcus replied, his voice filled with resolve. "We need to take immediate action, not just for the sake of this community, but for our department as well." As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus knew this was just the beginning. The incident would send shockwaves through the community and the precinct, but it could also be the spark they needed to ignite a larger movement for change. In the days that followed, the pressure mounted. The media descended upon the story, and protests erupted throughout the city, demanding justice for the young man who had lost his life. Marcus and Captain Bennett found themselves working around the clock, fielding calls, meeting with community leaders, and strategizing their response. With each passing day, it became clearer that the reforms they had initiated were no longer just about internal changes. They were part of a much larger dialogue about justice and accountability. Marcus felt the weight of this reality on his shoulders, but he also felt a sense of purpose driving him forward. They scheduled a press conference where they would address the incident and lay out their plan for accountability and transparency. As Marcus prepared his statement, he felt a mix of nerves and determination. This was his moment to speak for those who could not. But as the press conference approached, Lieutenant Graham made his move. Word spread that he intended to publicly denounce the reforms during the conference, urging officers to resist the changes. The threat loomed large, and Marcus knew that their united front was about to be tested. The day of the press conference arrived, heavy with anticipation and tension. The precinct was buzzing with reporters, cameras, and officials. Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he prepared to face the public eye, knowing that what he said would carry significant weight. As he stood in front of the podium, he glanced at Captain Bennett, who stood beside him, her expression resolute. They had rehearsed their statements, but the reality of the moment was far more daunting. The recent incident loomed large over them, and everyone was on edge, waiting to see how the police department would respond. The room quieted as the microphones were adjusted, and Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the collective gaze of the media and community members pressing down on him. He stepped forward, gripping the edges of the podium for stability. "Thank you all for being here today," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the turmoil churning within him. "We stand before you in a time of deep pain and reflection. Recent events have highlighted the urgent need for change within our department and our community." He glanced at the sea of faces, noticing the diverse reactions, some hopeful, others skeptical, and many filled with raw emotion. "Today, we acknowledge the tragic loss of a young life," Marcus continued, "and we extend our deepest condolences to the family and friends affected by this heart-wrenching incident. We cannot change what has happened, but we can and must learn from it." As he spoke, he felt the tension in the room shift slightly. He outlined the reforms that had been implemented, focusing on their commitment to transparency, accountability, and community engagement. He stressed the importance of training officers on de-escalation techniques and the need for continued dialogue with the community. But just as he began to discuss the importance of reform, Lieutenant Graham took the stage, his demeanor bold and defiant. "What you're hearing today are empty words," he declared, cutting through Marcus's speech. "We are police officers, not social workers. The changes being proposed will put our lives in danger and undermine our authority on the streets." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Marcus felt the tension escalate once again. He quickly regained his composure and stepped forward, refusing to let Graham's challenge derail the message they had worked so hard to convey. "Lieutenant Graham, with all due respect, we're not undermining our authority," Marcus countered, keeping his voice calm yet firm. "We are working to redefine it. Our duty is to protect and serve, not just through force, but through understanding and respect." The audience was divided, murmurs of agreement and dissent echoing through the room. Marcus felt a surge of determination as he continued. "We must build trust, not fear. If we want to ensure the safety of our officers and our community, we need to embrace change, not resist it." Graham's eyes blazed with indignation, and he stepped closer to the podium, leaning into the confrontation. "These changes are going to get people hurt. You're asking us to sacrifice our safety for a few feel-good initiatives that won't change a damn thing." The air grew thick with tension, and Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He recognized that this wasn't just a battle for the audience's attention. It was a struggle for the soul of the department. But just when it seemed like they were gaining traction, a shocking twist struck. The media uncovered a video of the incident that had sparked the protests, and it was damning. The footage showed Officer Harkins using excessive force, and the backlash was immediate. Marcus felt a sense of dread as he watched the news unfold. They were entering a new phase of this fight, one that would require not just courage, but unwavering commitment to accountability.